What really happens when the Time Variance Authority prunes a variant? What happens when we die? Do we get to live out the rest of our days just sitting on a cloud, wearing white robes and listening to tiny cherubs playing the harp? Are we reincarnated into another form like a butterfly or a frog or an alligator with a tiny hat? Or are we cruelly ripped from existence, our atoms rent asunder as we are disintegrated molecule by molecule in the blink of an eye? Well, if you believe the Time Variance Authority on Loki, it's definitely that last option. But what really happens when you get pruned? It's a term the Time Variance Authority uses for removing people, objects, and apparently entire branch timelines from the sacred timeline. Reset charges upon detonation prune the affected radius of a branch timeline to prevent a new reality from being formed, and that in turn stops the creation of a multiverse. The same seems to hold true for the TVA's energy truncheons, which are essentially these nightsticks that prune the person or object with which they make contact out of existence as well. At least that's what we've been led to believe, because Loki's 4th episode dwells on this very question and throws some surprising new wrinkles into the mix. And now we have a much better and darker idea of what being pruned actually means, and some theories and questions for the final 2 episodes of Loki. However, in order to talk about this in detail, we do need to spoil Loki episode 4, the Nexus Event. So if you haven't seen it yet, leave through the nearest time door before the timeline where you were unspoiled gets pruned in the process. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? As we saw in Loki episode 4, Loki goes from puny god to pruny god in the blink of an eye. During the episode's shocking finale, we learn the Timekeepers are actually elaborate Chuck E. Cheese style animatronics, and just when Loki's about to tell Sylvie how he really feels about her, Ravonna Renslayer prunes him from existence. Now, considering we saw Mobius get summarily murdered in the same fashion earlier in the episode, it's a devastating moment, until of course we get to the mid-credit scene.
Am I dead?
Despite seemingly being erased from existence, Loki finds that he is very much not dead. Rather, he awakens in this post-apocalyptic version of New York City where the Chitauri apparently won and no victory shawarma was had that day. Now, to the God of Mischief's surprise, he isn't the only Loki variant there either, because looming over him are 4 different Lokis. You have Richard E. Grant as classic Loki, a throwback to Loki's original comic book appearance in Journey into Mystery, Diobia Apare as boastful Loki, a nod to the Loki worthy of wielding Mjolnir from Loki Agent of Asgard, Jack Veal as Kid Loki who first appeared in Thor 617, and Gator Dunn, a brand new alligator version of the God of Mischief, a name I just made up. So, what's going on here? Well, think back to episode 2, The Variant, where Mobius tells us the Time Variance Authority has pruned more Lokis than almost any other type of variant. Based on this new evidence, it would appear that when pruned, all Loki variants are deposited into this ruined hellscape of a timeline. As we've seen teased in the trailers though, there are apparently even more Loki variants coming down the pipeline as well, like this Vote for Loki President version and these Fallout New Vegas as NPC Lokis as well. Now this in turn raises several other questions. Does what happened to Loki happen to everyone? If yes, are all these variants deposited in similar branch timeline prisons quantumly sealed off from the sacred timeline? And what does that mean for Mobius? If they're not, are only Lokis being preserved? And if so, why are only Lokis being preserved? So let's answer each of these questions one by one. Does what happened to Loki happen to everyone? So let us assume that the answer is yes, and if that is the case, we can safely assume that when the variants are pruned from existence, they're all deposited into these temporal prison realms where they're safely sequestered from the rest of the sacred timeline. That means that Mobius is probably talking about jet skis with another Mobius who's super into snowmobiles, and a third Mobius that's way too into Heelys for an adult human. They're just roller skates in your sneaker. Get over it, dude. Anyways, does this mean that all branch timelines are hermetically sealed off from the sacred timeline like little prisons, or are they really erased? Based on what happens to Loki, it seems like the former. Obviously, it's difficult to say without firm evidence of what happens to non-Loki variants, but it lends credence to the idea that much like in the comics, there are infinite versions of variants out there, which our notion of the multiverse would dictate that there are. Most of those variants would simply be sealed off in their current state of existence when their entire timeline is pruned by a reset charge. But those variants that escape, it seems, when pruned, get shunted into a garbage dump for other variants like them. So does this mean that those rings left on Ravonna Renslayer's office table were in fact from other Mobius variants who were then pruned when their usefulness to Ravonna and the Timekeepers had ended? Well, she did seem awfully sad to eliminate her favorite analyst in episode 4, but she also wasted no time at all in doing so. Possibly that's because she has another Mobius variant just waiting in the wings that can be mind-wiped, indoctrinated, then sent back into the field to how, now, and ka-chow its way into wowing his timeline-possessed bosses. And Morbius is always a good thing, if you ask me. No, not that one. It was a portmanteau, not that one. But what if what happens to Loki does not happen to every variant? Are only Lokis being preserved by the Time Variance Authority? And if so, why is that the case? Well, based on everything we've seen thus far, the TVA seems to have a deep and abiding interest in collecting the Gods of Mischief in all of their variant forms. Our proof in the space-time pudding is this temporal Loki prison, where all of these myriad Loki variants are apparently dumped for safekeeping. Now, the obvious reasoning here seems to be that Lokis are inherently meddlesome beings. As Sylvie puts it to Loki on Lamentis,
the universe wants to break free, so it manifests chaos.
Wherever a Loki goes, chaos tends to follow. I mean, just look at Loki's trajectory in the Marvel Cinematic Universe leading up to Endgame. He led an alien invasion of Earth, he usurped the throne of Asgard, and he manipulated his way to a position of power on a gladiatorial trash planet. That's a lot of chaos to sow for just one person. It constantly upended the natural order of things until other forces had to intervene and correct its course. So it's this push and pull that makes sense, and it's fundamental to our understanding of the natural order of the world. So consider this. The universe naturally tends towards entropy, meaning that despite our best efforts, inevitably, we're going to be drifting towards chaos, a quality that a Loki embodies in every fiber of their being. Whoever's running the Time Variance Authority is upsetting the natural order of things by pruning the sacred timeline like this space-time bonsai to their liking. That is an unnatural thing to do, which is why the universe responds by constantly offering up more Lokis to try and restore things to their naturally chaotic state. Or, in a wilder theory still, whoever's really behind the Time Variance Authority, which we'll address in another video, needs these Lokis alive precisely because of that chaotic energy. So maybe these Lokis are being used as some kind of battery to power the TVA's operations, harnessing their chaotic energy for some fell purpose, because after all, we aren't clear on how any of the Time Variance Authority technology works. Maybe there's some magic involved, and as we've seen from Sylvie, Lokis can have a variety of unexpected powers and abilities at their disposal.
What's he doing?
What are you doing?
But with all of that said, most likely it's that Lokis represent one of the greatest threats to a well-laid plan. Through manipulation, deception, and relentless charm, Lokis can usually pull the rug out from under whomever they're dealing with. And I mean, look, sure, they may ultimately lose in the end, but they just move on to the next scheme in their playbook. And that right there is truly unmatched chaos energy. And for an organization like the TVA that's all about control, it's difficult to think of a greater threat to their existence. So with that said, hopefully we'll get some of the answers that we're looking for when Loki Episode 5 drops next Wednesday. But in the meantime though, we've got you covered with our detailed breakdown of Episode 4 and theories galore just waiting for you over on Nerdist.com. But first, tell us, what do you think of these theories? What do you think actually happens when you get pruned? Is it just happening to Loki, or does this happen to every variant?
What? How?
Let us know in the comments below, and for the latest and greatest in the world of pop culture, stay tuned to Nerdist.com.